You know, the Appalachians don't need monsters to be terrifying. The silence here, the fog, the lakes, the way shadows move when nobody should be around. That's enough to keep you awake at night. Welcome to Eerie Echoes, where we share true Appalachian horror stories that feel a little too close to real. If you enjoy quiet but chilling tales, the kind that sit with you long after the video ends, hit subscribe and join our little campfire. It truly helps keep these stories alive, and I'm grateful you're here. Tonight we've got 4 stories from deep in the mountains, subtle, unsettling, and unforgettable. And the first begins at Summersville Lake, West Virginia, where a simple weekend trip turned into proof that someone was watching, much closer than anyone realized. Son friends in a quiet lake, what could possibly photobomb that? He'd been working doubles at a bar in Asheville for weeks, the kind of stretch that turned sleep into a rumor. So when Bryce texted about a long weekend in West Virginia, 6 friends, lake house, nothing on the schedule but floating and bad music, he said yes before the link even loaded. By Thursday afternoon, the group, him, Bryce, and his girlfriend Danny's best friend Na, plus a couple he just met, Jake and Marissa, rolled up a narrow gravel lane that ended in a pocket of hemlocks and a cedar-sided rental facing a quiet cove on Summersville Lake. The water was the still, dark kind of clear, with pale shale shelves dropping into sudden depth. No neighboring docks in sight, only the thin call of something in the trees and the gentle clink of water against the ladder. Inside, the house was Appalachian rental honest, creaky boards, a couch that belonged to 3 different decades, an old white fridge that hummed like it had an opinion. The deck view was a trap, the kind that makes people go silent for a beat without agreeing to. They unpacked, laughed, and within an hour were waist-deep by the dock comparing water temps to their bravado. By night it became cards, burgers, and the same 3 songs, finding them no matter what playlist they chose. Someone told a ghost story from college. Everyone heckled. Nobody believed anything. On the 3rd morning, he went to the dock alone with a chipped mug and the soft clack of flip-flops. That's when he noticed the kayak, faded yellow, tied to the far cleat with a clean bowline. They hadn't brought a kayak. The listing hadn't promised gear. He crouched. The rope was fresh wet, not lake-heavy or algae-furred, more like it had just been cinched by hands that knew knots. He reeled the stern closer and popped the little rear hatch. Inside, a single instant print, edges curled and sticky from moisture. The photo caught yesterday's 6 from across the cove, red cups, an inflatable swan, Bryce mid-cannonball, Na laughing at nothing. No one remembered a camera pointed their way. No one had posed. He slid the photo into his hoodie pocket and mentioned the kayak at breakfast as if it barely mattered. Jake shrugged and said maybe the rental came with toys. Danny said she hadn't seen one when they arrived. Bryce, batter-splattered and proud of it, tried to flip 3 pancakes with one wrist and failed gloriously. The conversation drifted back to plans, floating until their fingers wrinkled, then grilling too much on purpose. He nodded, went along, and kept finding the tree line with his eyes. All afternoon, the far bank felt like a face. Between hemlocks and rhododendron, the opposite shore offered a dozen good hides. A body length of shale here, a notch in rock there. Angles that would show a dock without showing the watcher. Sometimes he told himself he was imagining the geometry. Sometimes the geometry felt like a truth you accept or ignore. That evening, Bryce built a careful ring of fire by the water. A barred owl tried its cough-laugh call once from deeper in the trees and then gave up on them. When Danny ran in to grab marshmallows, he followed to find a flashlight. From the kitchen, the sliding glass door made the cove into a framed photo. Beyond his reflection, the lake was glossy black. He lifted the beam and panned once across, slow, not trying to call attention, more like a habit. For half a heartbeat, he saw what could have been a flick, the clean, coin-bright reflection of glass catching light. A beer bottle on the rock shelf, maybe. The face of a watch. A phone in a pocket turned just so. The reflection died so quickly he almost decided it hadn't lived. Near midnight, while the others were arguing over whether a marshmallow counts as food, he walked back to the dock with the flashlight off, habit again, As if light is what breaks quiet rather than voices, the yellow kayak was gone. Not loose, not drifted. Gone. The rope floated a foot from the cleat, slack, like a necklace unfastened above a collarbone. He stared a long time at the lane water makes when it travels, at the thin tremor that passes for motion when a night is windless. If a hull had knocked the dock, he'd have heard it. If a paddle had lazily knocked a rail, he'd have heard that too. He went back inside without waking anyone. They cleaned like saints on the last morning, emptied the trash, stripped beds, stacked dishes to pass as responsible. He did the final kitchen sweep that comes from too many closings at the bar. Wipe counters, check knobs, slide the glass door to the lock. On the inside of the slider at eye level was an instant print, taped with a torn strip of blue painter's tape. Same angle as the first photo. From the opposite bank, just one step closer. It showed them around the fire ring. Bryce hunched in a hoodie, Danny blowing across her cup, Na about to laugh again. Him, turned half over his shoulder looking toward the trees. He didn't say anything. He peeled the tape slow, freed the photo, laid it over the first in his hoodie pocket like one card hiding another. He would later notice little differences that felt bigger the longer they lived on his desk. In the first photo, the hemlock line ran behind them in a tidy sawtooth. In the second, the same line sat a fraction lower in the frame, as if the photographer had stooped or moved a step along the bank. The grain looked cleaner too, the faces sharper. You could nearly count the threads in his sleeve. There were charitable explanations you could rent for a few hours. Maybe the kayak belonged to a neighbor and had knocked loose, and a well-meaning someone had tied it off and then reclaimed it quietly to avoid awkward talk. Maybe another rental had kids with a long lens and good timing. Maybe two coincidences nested near each other and decided to look like a pattern. Other possibilities were less charitable but more likely. Whoever had tied that boat had touched their cleat and moved a knot without making the dock speak. Whoever had taped the second photo to the inside of the glass had entered the kitchen, past 6 pairs of shoes, past the cooler, past laughter loud enough to carry, and taped something in a house that wasn't theirs without drawing a single eye. That sort of competence didn't feel like kids. It felt practiced. It felt like something that takes whatever it wants from your attention and leaves what it wants you to notice. Later, back in Asheville, he pulled the photos out of the drawer sometimes and studied the background like a math problem. In the right corner of the second, in the dark wedge where the far trees overlap, there's a smudge that refuses to become a face. It's the size of a face, and yet it isn't one. He has held a ruler to the prints, measured the distance between their shoulders and the edge of the dock as if framing could confess. He has held them under a lamp and convinced himself he can see a soft echo of the fire ring's glow on something metallic on the opposite bank. A coin of light that shouldn't be there, or is there because fire makes coins out of everything. When he thinks about Summersville, he doesn't remember the flavor of the beer or the argument about whether you can float yourself into sobriety. He remembers the rope as a fact, wet without weight, clean without history. He remembers the kayak as a noun that arrived already inside their weekend. Like a word someone else wrote in the middle of a sentence he was speaking, he remembers tape torn diagonally, not straight. He thinks sometimes about how close a body has to be to tie a neat knot without letting the hull kiss the dock even once. And because he is not a person who makes friends with fear by giving it names, he does not name whoever used the bank like a balcony. He doesn't call them a voyeur or a swimmer or a neighbor who prefers silence. He only knows the way a camera collapses distance and how a lens can be both a way to see and a way to say, I was here. Nothing chased them, nothing broke, and no one screamed. Someone simply edited their weekend and left the evidence where only silence could find it. In the mountains, the most unsettling strangers aren't loud. They're precise. If subtle, real-tone Appalachian horror hits your nerves, a quick subscribe truly helps us keep making these. Thank you for being here. A watcher on a shoreline is one thing. Next comes a door that holds water where no water should be. A cozy sister weekend, unless the cabin keeps a room that behaves like a lake. She worked trauma shifts in Knoxville, the kind that teach you how to separate blood from panic, how to triage fear until it's manageable. After a brutal run of nights, psych patients, broken bones, a man trying to punch her for taking vitals, her sister Allison kept saying, Take a break before you break yourself. Finally, she did. Allison found a little place on Norris Lake. 2 bedrooms, wraparound porch, just enough Wi-Fi to mean comfort, not distraction. The listing showed deer heads on the walls and plaid couches, but promised quiet. That was all they wanted. Quiet. They drove up a winding road that turned to gravel, the forest closing in, the smell of damp pine and moss getting heavier. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was folding behind the ridge. The lake shimmered through trees, silver like spilled foil. Inside it was as promised, clean enough, rustic, a touch of hunting lodge. One detail snagged their eyes. In the hallway between the bedrooms, a door with a typed note taped to it. Owner storage. Do not open. Allison raised her eyebrows, grinning. Classic horror movie move, she said. They laughed, poured wine, and made frozen pizzas. By night, they were sitting on the porch under a sky black with Appalachian silence. The kind where you hear every frog, every cricket, every far-off dog bark echoing from another hollow. Nothing felt wrong yet. At 2:30 a.m. she woke. The cabin seemed too still, like someone had muffled it. Then she heard it. Soft sloshing, slow and uneven, like a bucket being pulled through water, and paused halfway. She sat up, holding her breath. The sound stopped. She checked the kitchen. Dry. Bathroom, nothing. Opened the fridge in case the ice maker was misbehaving. Quiet. As she passed the locked door, she felt the hair on her arms lift. The silence had weight there, like a blanket pressed against her head. She stood, hand on the knob, even though she knew it was locked. Then the noise faded into nothing. Morning came. She sipped coffee on the porch, trying not to say it. Allison beat her to it. Weird question, she said, eyes half closed from sleep. Did you hear water last night? Relief washed through her. Yeah, she admitted. Thought I imagined it. They let the conversation die, pretending it wasn't worth energy. Later, brushing her teeth, she bent to spit and caught a dark smear at the base of the storage door. She frowned, crouched, and touched it. Cold, wet. Not dew, not condensation. Water, a thin line seeping under the frame. She called the number on the rental sheet. A man named Corey answered, his voice groggy. She explained. He interrupted. That's not possible. There's no plumbing in there. She insisted she was looking at it. He told her not to touch the door, promised he'd call the owner and get back. He never did. By noon, the wet patch had spread across the hall carpet, a fan of dampness growing darker. They tried towels, checked every pipe and faucet in the cabin. Nothing explained it. Allison said what both were thinking. We can't just let it flood. Her sister hesitated. He said, don't open it. Allison gave her the look only a younger sibling can, half annoyance, half dare. Really? We're going to drown a rental to follow the rules? They fetched a long skewer from the kitchen and started working the latch. It took longer than it should have. When it finally gave, the sound was like a kiss unbroken. Cold air breathed out, damp and immediate. The room was the size of a closet. Ankle-deep water covered the floor, rippling faintly as if stirred seconds ago. The walls were dry, the ceiling spotless. No plumbing, no cracks, just water that existed where water shouldn't. The smell was wrong. Damp, yes, but also metallic, almost briny. A tang that belonged to coasts, not Appalachian lakes. In one corner, plastic bins were stacked, lids buckled slightly with age. A rolled rug leaned against the wall, dark at its edges. On the back of a folding chair hung a wetsuit. Not modern neoprene, but older. Thick, heavy stitched seams dulled by time. It was soaked, dark patches glistening. Algae clung to its shoulders and strings. A fine crust of white traced the cuffs, the sort you see when salt dries. This wasn't lake wet. This was sea wet. The single small window was cracked open. Around the sill, beads of water gathered like pearls and ran down one by one. The frame held a thin line of silt as though something had climbed through. Something dripping, heavy. Not careful enough to wipe itself clean. But there were no footprints in the water on the floor. No boot prints leading away. The water rippled softly, then stilled as if it had just been disturbed and now was resting again. They froze, neither crossing the threshold. The wetsuit seemed like a stand-in for a body. Allison whispered, This doesn't make sense. She was right. If it had been left here before the room was sealed, it would have dried. If it had been placed here later, someone had opened the door without keys. And if it had come through the window, there should be a trail out. But there was only water, patient and cold. They shut the door, threw their clothes into bags with movements too quick, too loud, left beds unstripped, dishes unwashed. Allison laid towels against the spreading damp as though tidying a crime scene. They placed the key on the counter, scrawled "leak in owner room" on a scrap of paper, and drove out without looking back. At a diner off US 27 halfway to Knoxville, she finally Googled the history of Norris Lake. Found mentions of drowned roads, schools, entire towns left underwater when the dam rose, divers talking about submerged porches, doors still on their hinges, stories of kids daring each other to swim down and touch church steeples. She didn't share the worst of what she read. Not yet. She just told Allison the smell wasn't lake water. Allison said it again, briny, like the ocean had come knocking in a landlocked hollow. Back home, she keeps thinking about the water moving as though someone had just passed through. About the wetsuit draped so casually, as if a person stepped out and hung it up ready to use again tomorrow. About the beads on the sill, each one proof of motion, proof of something dripping from elsewhere. Maybe Corey had heard calls like hers before. Maybe other guests woke to sloshing and damp carpet and thought they'd imagined it. Maybe he knew there were rooms in those rentals that opened when they shouldn't. She hasn't asked. She doesn't need confirmation. She knows the truth she felt in her bones in that cold air. The Appalachians keep their own water, hidden in mines and caves and drowned valleys. Sometimes what lives there borrows a door, and sometimes it forgets to close the window behind it. Some doors aren't storage, they're passage, and water doesn't need permission to arrive. If slow burn Appalachian dread feels like the kind of horror you'd believe, a quick subscribe helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for listening. From water creeping where it shouldn't, to gifts stacked neatly on a doorstep, by hands that never show their face. Free firewood? Finally, a horror story with perks. Aaron had taken a leave from the firm to start the book he'd promised himself for years. His partner, Mason, found a small cabin off a gravel loop west of Brevard, where the mountains fold in on themselves and pines hold the wind like a secret. Off-season meant a better rate and the kind of quiet that made you hear your own shoes. The cabin was simple: stone fireplace, a sagging couch, paperbacks that had swollen in the damp, and a porch facing a wedge of trees and a thin slice of sky. Before they even unlocked the door, they saw it, a stack of fresh-cut wood to the left of the steps. The pile was neat in a way that felt deliberate, each log the same length, bark clean, the cut faces pale. On the topmost piece, sap beaded like clear pins. A lace of new sawdust lay along the edge as if someone had brushed it there minutes before. Aaron called the property manager to say thanks. The man, Troy, sounded surprised. "Wasn't us," he said. "Ain't had anybody up there in weeks. Closest place I maintain's miles out." Aaron laughed softly, as if generosity from strangers had a phone number. "Then we've got a kind neighbor," he said, and let it go. They settled into a routine that looked like rest. A walk down the old road toward a rhododendron thicket, late coffee, a few paragraphs on Aaron's laptop that felt promising. The forest did what forests do, small snaps of branches, a squirrel's private debate, a single crow practicing the letter A. By night, they let a playlist run and read by the lamp. Around midnight, Aaron muted the music. Footsteps passed steadily across the gravel, not hurried or sneaking, just a person's pace. Mason moved to the window and pulled the curtain a finger's width. The porch light cut the front yard into a dim triangle. Beyond it, only trees and their thoughts. The footsteps turned toward the side yard, then faded. Aaron pictured a raccoon sorting a plan. Mason said nothing. Morning added a second surprise. A new stack of wood had appeared to the right of the steps. Smaller, but the same tidy geometry, the same pale cuts, the same suggestion that a square can be a signature. Aaron touched the end of a log and felt tackiness on his palm. He wiped it on his jeans without thinking and pretended to find this funny. "If the next one comes with a bow on it," Mason said, "we leave a tip." They tried to believe in ordinary. They hiked a short ridge and ate sandwiches on a deadfall. They talked about where the book might go. But when the sun slanted out and shadows came up from the ground, the quiet lifted its mask. Sometime after 11, a sound threaded itself through the walls. Crunch on gravel. A pause. Then far off but distinct, a thunk, the flat, dull seat of an axe into wood. They killed the lamp and waited. Aaron stood where he could see the door and the window in one glance. Mason sat with the fireplace poker across his knees like a polite promise. The crunches came and went. They saw nothing. Sleep arrived mean and brief. At dawn, a third stack waited at the foot of the steps. It sat so close the corner of the square lined with the edge of the porch like a diagram. Aaron bent, noticing a thin smear of resin on the top log where a palm might have braced. The smear held a partial whirl, not a print you could lift, just the suggestion that skin had been there and intended to be forgotten. Inside, Mason reached for his gloves, brown work gloves he'd left on a peg by the door. One was missing. They found it 15 minutes later wedged between two logs in the newest stack, 2 fingers tucked. The leather damp and smelling like fresh pine and cold air. That's when Aaron called Troy again. A deputy named Nolan arrived an hour later on the slow tires of local law. He took in the stacks without flinching, walked the perimeter and looked at the ground the way a person looks at a map they mostly know. "This ridge had a fella used to live off-grid," he said at last, hat balanced on his thumb. Name was Harlan Witt. Cut wood for folks whether they asked or not. Wouldn't let a stove go empty if he heard it breathe. He went quiet a few years back. Nolan's mouth tilted in a way that meant there were versions of the story he wasn't going to offer. Could be someone carrying on the habit. Could be somebody thinks this place is empty when it ain't. "What do we do?" Mason asked. "Lock your door," the deputy said as if it were both advice and apology. "If you see anybody, call." He tipped 2 fingers and drove away, his taillights brief red commas in the trees. They lasted one more night because it felt silly not to. Dusk pressed itself to the windows. Aaron tried writing. The sentence wouldn't hold. Around 3, he woke with the particular certainty that another person was close. No sound at first, just the idea of a presence turned into air. It came then softly. A footfall in the pine duff, a shift of weight, a breath against the window glass that made the cold pane bloom and fade. He stared at his own reflection until it looked like a stranger, and then like himself again. By morning, the stacks hadn't multiplied. The 3 that existed sat as if they had always been there, square faces to the world, the kind of order that pretends it isn't a message. Aaron went out and set his palm on the top of the nearest pile. Tacky again. Embedded in the resin this time was a single pine needle, dark and perfect, laid like a line under a signature. He didn't say anything to Mason until the keys were in his hand. "We should go," he said, and Mason nodded like they had both arrived at the same page a while ago and been too polite to read it out loud. They left the dishes in the sink and the beds unmade, left a note for Troy that said thank you for the stay and nothing else. Halfway down the gravel, Aaron braked. In the rear view, a pale shape stood between the trees at the edge of the yard. He gripped the wheel and then realized he was looking at a birch trunk angled just so, bark peeling to a face he'd invented. He laughed once without sound. They rolled on. On the highway, the world resumed its ordinary clarities, gas stations, signs, a radio that couldn't keep a station. But Aaron's mind kept returning to the alignment, how the last stack had squared to the step, how the glove had found its place in the top layer as if returned from a fitting. There's a distance at which help is tidy and kind. There's a closer distance where help becomes presence, and presence becomes a hand on the wood you'll burn. Back at home, the smell hung around a day, resin and cold and something like the clean side of a workshop. Aaron finally took the glove from the bag and turned it over. A pinhead of sap had hardened along the seam, catching the light. He pressed it with his thumbnail. It didn't give. They didn't report anything beyond what they already had. What would the report say? Someone stacked wood too neatly? Someone cut logs with an axe you never saw? The deputy had given them the only rule that mattered. Lock your door. It felt like a rule for inside, not outside. The Stacks had never tried the door. In other versions of the story, the ones strangers might invent, Harlan Witt is a ghost, or a man who slipped under in the river and kept his habit on the bank. Aaron didn't need a legend. He only needed the math. Day 1, a stack appears. Day 2, another. Night 2, an axe speaks its one-syllable name far off. Day 3, a stack inches to the step and holds a glove long enough to drink its warmth and give it back. He tells himself it could have been courtesy, misdirected. That's the gentle ending. The harsher one is more honest. Someone walked the distance between the tree line and their porch without wanting to be known, and he was good at his job. Aaron keeps the glove on a shelf now, not as a relic but as a reminder. When he catches its smell, the memory that comes first isn't fear. It's the perfection of that square. The right angles cut into wood like a man could measure loneliness and make it stack. Help is comforting when you know the helper. Anonymous kindness in the woods is still a presence, and presence has a way of measuring how close you'll allow it. If this kind of slow, believable Appalachian dread works for you, a quick subscribe truly helps us keep these coming. Thank you for listening. From gifts arranged at your doorstep to footsteps rising from the water. Next, a lakeside couple learns what fog decides to bring ashore. Lakeside retirement, coffee at dawn, painting at dusk, and mysterious screams in the fog. David had given 20 years to the Army as a medic, and he'd thought retirement would finally mean calm. He and his wife chose Fontana Lake, a stretch of dark Appalachian water folded between the Smokies, where ridges rise sharp and clouds snag on the peaks like cloth. They found a modest cedar house with a dock, a wide porch, and no neighbors in shouting distance. They named it Still Water. That was what they wanted most. Stillness. For a while, they had it. Mornings meant coffee on the porch with fog lifting off the lake like smoke. Afternoons meant his wife painting and David tying fishing flies. Evenings meant the kind of silence only hollows know, punctuated by whip-poor wills, by the crack of far-off branches, by nothing at all. They believed they'd traded in chaos for peace, and then late October came. He woke one morning at 4:30, not sure why. The house was cold, colder than the season allowed. The fog outside pressed so thick he could barely see the yard's edge. He stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water when he heard it. A scream. Not an animal's cry, not a trick of a loon, but human, raw and desperate, cutting across the fog like a blade. He froze, listening. A second scream followed, muffled, jagged with panic. He called to his wife to stay inside and ran to the dock, jacket unzipped, flashlight in hand. The beam showed nothing. The fog had made the lake a wall of white. The water at the ladder barely stirred. He called 911. A patrol boat was out, they said. They'd sweep his side. He waited an hour, watching the void. The voices never came again. The patrol boat appeared finally. Two vague shapes in the whiteness asking routine questions. They'd seen nothing. Sound carries strange, they said. Could have been Miles. He nodded, but his skin prickled in a way Miles don't explain. The day played normal. They forced it to. By sunset, though, fog rolled back with a kind of hunger. It crept fast, swallowing the opposite shore, creeping up the slope until the porch screens wore beads of water. Even the night insects silenced, their choir cut mid-song. Around 9, locking up the shed, David heard a splash. Not a fish, too heavy, too deliberate. Another closer. He edged toward the dock, flashlight beam wobbling in the fog. Something banged against the ladder, a sharp metal knock from beneath. He swung the light, expecting maybe a log or a stray board. The water was still. No ripples, no evidence of what had struck. That night, they slept in the living room with lamps on. He dozed in his chair, flashlight across his lap. Around 2, footsteps sounded across the deck. Not hurried, not sneaking, wet, bare, unhurried. They crossed half the porch, paused, then turned back the way they'd come. He didn't move. He didn't even part the curtain. He only listened until silence returned. By dawn, the motion light by the door remained off. On the dock, though, his beam found them. Footprints. Bare, human, wet. They climbed up from the ladder, walked 10 feet along the boards, then ended, cut clean like the person had dissolved into air. No return prints, no drag. Just presence, paused, then erased. He didn't call law again. What could he report? Footsteps that refused to finish. Instead, he checked their trail cam, set in the trees to catch deer. It had nothing unusual, a raccoon, a blurry bird. No movement from the water side. The gap wasn't just empty, it was intentional. Sensors failed when the fog came, or something had walked too close to be seen. At the bait shop the next day, he asked the old clerk casually if people ever heard things on the lake. The man grew still. "You're not the first," he said. "Fog season's got rules. Don't answer a voice unless it calls your name." He left it there. No smile, no shrug. Just a rule passed on like a prayer. When their niece and her boyfriend visited the following weekend, David didn't mention any of it. No need to scare them. They ate on the porch as dusk thickened. Fog came early, rolling fast, erasing the ridgeline until even the close trees looked drawn in pencil. A faint tap echoed from the dock ladder. His niece leaned over the rail. "Did someone fall in?" He forced a smile. "Probably a fish." They laughed it off, went inside. After they went to bed, David sat in the same chair by the window, flashlight balanced across his knees. At 2, the steps came again. Slow, deliberate. They reached the boards just outside the glass. He didn't pull the curtain, didn't look. He sat rigid, breathing shallow. A minute later, the sound receded, fading back into fog. He stayed awake until daylight. Morning brought a dock that looked innocent. No new prints, no wet marks. But the ladder's rungs dripped in a way dew never makes. Steady drops falling into water already smooth. He told his wife then, finally, that they should sell. She said she'd been thinking the same since the first scream. In the weeks that followed, the fog came and went. The screams came too, fainter each time, farther away, like a recording being played back with less conviction. He never answered. He never stepped on the dock. He learned the rules. Keep the lights on. Keep the blinds drawn. Keep your voice to yourself when the fog arrives. Sometimes he sat with the flashlight and imagined what he'd see if he dared part the curtain. A figure dripping on the porch, head tilted, waiting for him to acknowledge it. He never tested the vision. He already knew the truth. The water doesn't always give back what it takes. Sometimes it brings things instead. The Appalachians carry their own ghosts. Miners still coughing in sealed shafts. Children's laughter around drowned schools. Widows who stand by rivers that took their husbands. Fontana Lake has fog that decides what belongs. David and his wife moved out by spring. They left behind a house with a name that no longer fit. Stillwater had become anything but. Daylight makes lakes honest. Fog doesn't. It edits sound, hides faces, and leaves prints that go nowhere. What you don't look at is sometimes all that keeps you safe. If Appalachian stories that feel too real keep you up at night, subscribing really helps us keep telling them. Thanks for being part of this. From strangers on your dock to voices in the fog, our next video looks at 4 times even the police couldn't help. Because sometimes the scariest words are, "There's nothing we can do."